I thought I was safe too. Now look at me, Blake said. I'm lucky to be alive. You have no idea the atrocities, the brutality, and monstrosities I've witnessed. I was viciously beaten, tortured, and made to witness unspeakable and heinous acts done to both my wife and daughter. That last sentence sent a bone-chilling terror throughout Jody's body. What happened, I asked. I haven't been able to make radio contact with you in 4 days. Every night at 18 hours I would call out and anxiously await for a response from you. And every night the same result. Nothing, nada, just dead air. Blake's still out of it, confused, bewildered, and disoriented from his experience. Asked what day it is. It's Saturday, December 26th, the day after Christmas, I answered. Now noticing his heavily bandaged left hand that was throbbing with pain, he began to recount and tell us of his horrifying encounter. Breathing heavily and with tears beginning to stream down his cheeks, he said 4 days ago he was out back of his house splitting wood for the fireplace. It was mid-morning when 2 snowmobiles with 4 men pulled up to his house. He didn't hear them approaching over the sound of his gas generator. By the time he stepped through the back door carrying in the freshly split wood, his wife had already granted them access inside their home. She fell for their disguise, hook, line, and sinker, but Blake knew right away they weren't real law enforcement, but just imposters preying on the naive with knockoff uniforms. Initially, they said they spotted the smoke coming out of the chimney and heard the reverberating sound of the generator and thought they could stop in to warm up while out on their patrols. Blake's wife had already served the 4 of them with hot, flavorsome, roasting cups of real coffee. Blake's home-powering generator and the life-changing warmth of his fireplace had made his family a target in doomsday. During an extreme, catastrophic collapse like the kind we're experiencing, where life as we know it has entirely changed, it is likely law enforcement and emergency responders will be non-existent. When things go grim, empty store shelves, no utilities, civil unrest, raging infernos, and mass riots, we'll have no choice but to fend for ourselves. Many of us who prepare for these situations understand the possible threats. There can be some things that we overlook. Desperate and dangerous lunatics in your town will be roaming the neighborhoods looking for easy victims to target. During a crisis, such as a cataclysmic coronal mass ejection, you simply can't bank on calling 911. You're going to have to be able to defend yourself. During doomsday, you need to be on the lookout for every potential risk, including groups impersonating both law enforcement and military personnel. When things spiral completely out of control and civilization turns to chaos, you'll see criminals preying on the naive, the elderly, and the innocent by pretending to be the police. You have to be able to quickly determine who are the real LEOs and who are the deranged, unhinged, and frenzied fakes. Because when the rapture erupts and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse come galloping in, you and only you are responsible for your safety. Blake's wife made the fatal and devastating decision to allow the 4th and final horseman of the apocalypse, the pale green one, ridden by death, to simply walk in through their front door. Once allowed access, they raped, pillaged, tortured, abused, and punished the family of 3. Behind the safety and security of the walls, Blake had went outside unarmed to chop wood, leaving behind his Smith & Wesson M&P on the kitchen counter. Once back inside and fearing the fraudulent foursome, he immediately noticed his firearm was gone. Common sense and his instincts told him these were not legitimate law enforcement officers. The knockoff uniforms were cheaply made and did not fit their bodies immaculately. The badges were flimsy, the utility belts were missing required tools, and none of the 4 were carrying radios. What the sinister swindlers didn't know was Blake was a volunteer fireman for the town and knew the majority of the police force on a first-name basis. Each of the 4 men had the vile look of lust in their eyes as they sipped their coffee and obsessively stared at both Blake's wife and 17-year-old daughter. He knew what their unholy and immoral intentions were. The problem was he was unarmed and outnumbered. His only option was to deceive the goons, make them feel welcomed, and hope he could make it to his gun safe before they decided to act on their ill-omened scheme. His Liberty gun safe sat upstairs in his bedroom of the two-story colonial house. Up until that fateful day, they had been surviving better than most. A 2200-watt inverter generator providing power to essential appliances and light sources. A comforting source of warmth from a wood-burning fireplace, and a freezer full of venison. They were warm, content, and had full bellies of food. Hunkered down since the start of the collapse, surviving, thriving, and prospering, until the death-dealing Grim Reaper knocked on the door. Things can turn dramatically quick during Tiawaki. 1 minute you're enjoying playing wholesome, fun family games, and the next you're being tied up, tortured, tormented, disfigured, as you helplessly watch your wife and daughter fall victim to vicious vultures hell-bent on violating their bodies. Blake knew it was imperative to let his family know the 4 men were indeed fraudulent imposters, but there was absolutely zero chance he'd be left alone with them to do so. This wasn't the first house the group had ransacked, ravaged, and preyed upon. They had a method to their nefarious madness, gaining trust and then separating the males from the females. It's one thing to protect yourself and your family from an intruder, but it's an entirely different ballgame when it's a formidable, well-organized gang. The group of 4 menacing flimflamers quickly realized Blake had noticed his sidearm was missing. "Looking for this?" one of them questioned. "We've been ordered to confiscate all firearms, ammunitions, and weapons we come across." "Ordered by who?" Blake sternly retorted. "We're under zero obligation to discuss who we take instruction from. So now let's take a look around your residence and see what else you have for us," the leader of the 4 commanded. "You can either show us, or we'll tear this place upside down, inside out, and find what you're hiding." Blake knew he had to act before his family would become prisoners and captives of the collapse. Hoping to create a distraction, sacrifice his safety, or possibly even lose his life, he drew his pocket knife, yelled for his wife and daughter to flee now as he lunged at the marauder closest to him, driving the razor-sharp Kershaw blade into the man's ribs while headbutting him to the ground. Chaos ensued as the fracas kicked off in the kitchen. "Go, go, go," he shouted to his wife and daughter as he charged at the next thug who had possession of his M&P. The mother and daughter bolted for the front door, lacking both the necessary resources and means to survive for long outside during the white, violent winter. No hat, no gloves, no jacket, and being pursued by 2 brutal bandits, determined and dead set on capturing them both alive so they could have their way with them. Back inside, the melee and skirmish continued as Blake tried to regain control of his pistol. The 2 tussled and wrestled across the kitchen table. Blake knew this was survival mode, and this was far from a gentleman's quarrel as he bit down on the man's nose, spitting the flesh and blood back into his opponent's eyes, hoping to temporarily blind him. Unfortunately for him, the man he stabbed and knocked to the ground was now back on his feet, putting an end and abolishing the advantage he had gained. The wounded pillager, adamant on revenge, picked up the same coffee pot Blake's wife had graciously used to fill their cups up with and smashed it across his head, knocking him into the linoleum-covered floor. Once they had him down and disoriented, the 2 began to pummel, pound, and thrash him, relentless and persistent, punishing blows to his body. "We're going to teach you a lesson, son, and when our 2 friends return with your beautiful, seductive, and sensual family, the 4 of us will show them what it's like to be ravaged in bed by real men." Severely battered, bruised, and walloped, Blake was now helpless as the assailants used heavy-duty zip ties to restrain and shackle him. The one hooligan he had managed to impale and puncture was still bleeding out profusely, and was worried he'd eventually succumb from the stab wound. He was now anxious and on edge, and kept asking his partner in pillaging if he was going to die. Blake grinned and said, "If you don't stop that hemorrhaging, you're going to die tonight, you bastard." Shaken and shocked by Blake's brazenness, the injured hooligan pointed the M&P he obtained directly into Blake's mouth and threatened to blow a hole through his head, before settling on pistol-whipping him until he was unconscious. For the next several hours he drifted in and out of consciousness, not sure if the vile and sinful images and horrific screams and pleas for help were hallucinations or not. Until finally one of the four dirtbags decided to pour a boiling, scalding hot pot of water over his head and body. The hot water scalding caused pain and damage to the skin from the moist heat and vapors. This was a type of burns that can dangerously destroy affected skin tissues and cells. Within mere seconds, Blake's body went into shock from the searing heat. His quaint two-story home on a quiet street had been turned into a house of horrors in just mere hours. It took less than 15 minutes for the wife and daughter to be rounded back up and captured. It took even less time for the four scumbags to violate and desecrate the two women. Bound, gagged, and held at knife point, they suffered unthinkable, repulsive, and repeated acts of assault. Many of those exploits Blake was forced to witness. Powerless, helpless, and demoralized, all he could do was cry at the savagery taking place. It was a husband and father's job to protect his family, but due to the darkness, immorality, and ruthless nature of this new world, he had failed dismally. He wondered if the three of them were lucky enough to survive this horrific situation, if he'd ever be able to look his kin in their eyes again. Repeated beatings, assaults, and menacing amounts of torture continued over the following days. The four degenerates not only indulged in feeding their hunger, but also fed and fulfilled their wicked and felonious fantasies. They enjoyed hearty meals, warm beverages, and cozy fires, while Blake and his family were starved, beaten, and abused. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days for the maltreated family of three. On the morning of day 4, after 90-plus hours of constant bleeding and suffering, the predator Blake stabbed on day 1 finally succumbed and perished from the fatal stab wound, never waking up that morning. The three remaining perpetrators would decide to ravage the family with cumulative depredation and destruction. They took Blake's badly beaten body out back and ordered his wife to take the wood-splitting axe and remove her husband's pinky and ring finger on his left hand. The same ring finger that he proudly wore his wedding ring on. Unbeknownst to the thugs, but 20 years ago yesterday on Christmas Eve, he had proposed to his would-be wife. 20 years later, they could have never fathomed, grasped, or made sense of the violence and sadism that they would fall victim to. They gave his wife two choices: sever her husband's fingers off or watch helplessly as they execute their 17-year-old daughter right in front of them. Two of them carried Blake's hog-tied body over to the wood-chopping block, releasing his left arm and laying his two fingers across it. His wife trembled in terror. She already had been subjected to so much over the 4 prolonged days. The third molester stood with his daughter and commanded her to open her mouth so he could slide the barrel of his Smith & Wesson into it. She initially refused until he fired a round inches from her head, increasing the tension and strain in the situation. Now relenting, she hesitantly opened her mouth, and he forcefully pushed the barrel in so far she gagged on it. Tears were flowing down her cheeks, as well as both of her parents. "Well, what's it going to be? Your precious daughter's life? Or your weak pussy of a husband's fingers?" he asked. As crazy as it sounds, she hesitated and debated. This wasn't a world she wanted her daughter living in. It was a nasty, harsh, evil, and vile existence since the lights went out. Her daughter's virginity had been robbed repeatedly by rapists. "Jennifer," Blake shouted, "what are you doing? Pick up the axe and do it already." Shaken, rattled, and quivering with fear, she finally brought back the razor-sharp axe and then swung it forward, severing and slicing her husband's 2 fingers off as he screamed in agony. At the same time, the third monster squeezed the trigger and executed their daughter anyway, disposing of her right in front of her mom and dad. Jennifer fell to her knees in shock, dropping the axe as she collapsed onto the snow-covered ground that was now stained with both her husband and her daughter's blood. It was a traumatic and disturbing scene. Blake, with a broken and battered heart, promised to kill the 3 men as he bled out heavily. "You can't be serious, can you?" the leader asked. "Look at your daughter's dead body. This happened because you're too weak and soft. You couldn't save her or your wife, you pitiful excuse of a protector. Your wife even whispered to me when I was in bed with her how inept you are. "Get him out of here and take him for a ride, would you?" he said to the predator who killed Blake's daughter. They proceeded to tie Blake to the back of one of the snowmobiles and dragged him around like trash up and down the street. Dressed in only jeans, a t-shirt, and barefoot, he was launched like a projectile into mailboxes, hard-packed snowbanks, and telephone poles. Feeble, vulnerable, and near death, the rope eventually broke, and he desperately got a head start on making his escape before the monster realized he was gone. Shoeless, concussed, and anguished, he evaded capture and made the 2+ mile trek to my front door.